this off to record. All right, welcome everybody. We are going to go through showing properties and writing offers tonight. Okay, and I specifically wanted to sort of take this smaller chunk to make it a little bit easier, to make it practical for you. A lot of you are starting to get out and get in front of the clients and actually do showings and write offers. So I want to break it down into those little components. And specifically, I want to address today the different things that you want to take into account as you go through that process in today's market, and probably going forward a lot in this market in terms of, what are the questions you ask, what's the process and things that you put together. So let me shoot over here to share screen, see if this works. How's that? Everybody see that? Can I go to that? It's even better. How's that? Even better? Uh-oh. What did I do? Sorry, hold on. I opened something here and I can't close it out. And now it's going to be in my way. All right, there we go. Okay, good. Everybody see the screen okay? Perfect. Let's move you guys over here. Here we go. All right, so tonight what I want to go through is talk about actually showing properties in the market today. What does that look like? What are the different things that are available for showing property? How do you set up those appointments? How would you set up the conversations with the clients around that? We'll talk about the offer. So if you show the property and the client's interested in the property, what are the questions you need to ask to prepare for the offer? What kind of research should you be doing also to get, to prepare for writing an offer? And then actually, how do you write up that offer? So what does the offer look like? What are the components that go into that? I'll talk about the offer package, what should be sent over to the other agent. And that, so we'll take it right from, sort of identifying, showing properties all the way through actually sending that offer into that other agent and presenting that offer to that agent. And then we'll talk a little bit, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about negotiation and that process from there. But the intention is to go right up through the offer and all the components of the offer. Does that work for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, just an occasional head nod. Tim, you're in my range of sight, so. All right, so let's talk about why is this moving forward on its own? I need to not touch anything, apparently. Finding and previewing properties for your clients. Again, most of this should be fairly review for a lot of you. Some of you are brand new in the room, but most everybody's been around for a little bit. Obviously, we have MLS PIN, which is available for us to go out and take a look at the properties that might apply for our client. Now, I want to back up just one step. This is assuming a lot of things, right? This is assuming we've already talked to our client about their needs and wants. We've already made sure that they're pre-approved for this process. We've talked to them about what's important to them in a property. So what does that wish list look like? What are they looking for, right? And so we're going to start the search in MLS based on those specs. Now, one of the things you want to be careful of when you're looking in MLS, and again, they may be talking about specific area, price point. You want to understand based on what's going on in the market, how you want to look for properties, okay? And in today's market specifically, and a lot of the markets we're looking at, things are going for over asking, sometimes significantly over asking. So let's say your clients are approved for $450. That would be the absolute max that they could afford. They're looking in the Waltham area. They'd like a single family. They'd like something with 3 bedrooms, but there's a little flexibility there. And they're thinking, somewhere, probably over 1,500 square feet, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 square feet, right? So I would start to do a search based on that budget in the area they're looking for. I might put all the specs in to see what kind of options I have. In today's market, be aware, the inventory is tight. So we have to start to look at, well, what other options would I have for them in that price point? Okay, now Waltham also happens to be a fairly aggressive market. So if I know that 450 is the absolute highest they can afford, I'm not going to start showing them 450 houses, am I? Because if I do that, I'm going to set them up for failure. So I might look at stuff that's like 4 to 430 400 to 430 or under 430, so that I can set them up that they have a little bit of room. If they need to go over asking, they'll actually be able to do that. So set them up for success, have good conversations, take into account what they're looking for. You're going to naturally have to play with this and do extra research. So let's say you throw the search in there and nothing comes up, right? Which could happen depending on the specs that you're looking at. Then you have to start to have conversations with your clients about, look, I mean, let's say they say, well, we want a $300,000 colonial in Waltham. Well, we know we can't do that, right? So we have to help guide them into what they can do. So I can't get you a $300,000 colonial in Waltham, but I can get you the size and the number of bedrooms you're looking for in a condo if we go a little further west, right? Is that an option? If that's not an option and you really want that single family house in Waltham, well, this is what the budget needs to look like. Is that an option? Right? So don't ever make an assumption of affordability or non-affordability. Ask really good questions to make sure that you identify what's really important to them and what they can live with and what they can't live without. Okay? Everybody, most times, are going to give you pretty heavy wish lists. It's always good to narrow that into what's the most important. What are the sort of the drop deads that I have to have that I can't give up on? Versus, well, I might be a little more flexible if I find the right property.
Paula,
yeah.
Is there like a magic number you would say to tell clients in terms of needs? Like if, let's say they make a list that's 30 long, would you say, okay, narrow it down to your top 10 or your top 5? Is there like a solid number?
There's not a magic number, Ashley, but you're right. 30 is going to be kind of ridiculous. So, what you might want to say is, look, tell me the top couple of things that are the really most important. Because if they're going 30 down, then they're never going to find anything that meets those requirements. So maybe 3 to 5 first.
Gotcha.
And then we can go from there and see what else. If you have the more you have on the list, the harder you make it for them to successfully find a property.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Question. Yeah. You want to make sure you're showing all properties available. Now, right now in MLS, right, you have very little inventory. So what are your other options in terms of finding properties that are available? Well, you got to get creative. Right now, because of the COVID crisis, you want to make sure you actually look at temporarily withdrawn items as well. Because there might be things that had come on the market and not gone under contract, but might still potentially want to sell, but they pulled it off the market because of the showing stuff. And if you call them and say, look, I've got a serious buyer, really wants to get into this property, or your seller still looking to sell, we're putting a lot of things under contract that are coming out of the temporarily withdrawn status right now. Sometimes we go back and look at the expireds to see if there's some options and reach out to some of the expired people and say, hey, I've got a buyer. I know you were looking to sell. It looks like your property expired, but I've got a buyer that really would be interested in a home like yours. And, are you still considering selling? Would you be interested in showing it to them? You want to make sure you set up your buyers in, you can set them up for an automatic update in MLS. Ideally, what I like to do is set yourself up for that update so that it comes to you and you can reach out to your clients and say, hey, this is a property that just came on the market today. Let's talk about this one. And I'm going to send it over to you. Let me know if you think this one works based on the pictures and stuff, right? So you need to be plugged into the market that they want and staying on top of that. The other thing you can do if there's not inventory, and we talk about this in the sales meetings, find out if there's other folks in the office that have things coming. Keep an eye on Facebook. There's a Boston Agent Connect Facebook page right now where there's a lot of coming soon stuff that's out there. You can Google like coming soon Waltham Colonials to see what comes up in terms of other sites, because there's other sites that have stuff for coming soon. So there's all kinds of ways you can do sort of above and beyond research to try to dig out those opportunities in this tight market. Make sure any advice you're giving them in terms of properties comes from facts, not just opinion stuff, right? So an example of that is sort of what I said before. The buyer wants, they want a 4-bedroom colonial in Waltham and their budget's $450,000. Well, maybe we know from looking at the market that might be tough, but hey, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I can probably get you that colonial in Waltham at $450,000, but that's probably going to be a 3-bedroom, not a 4-bedroom. Or, maybe it's a different style house to get that extra space or that 4th bedroom that would get you into that price. So you want to open up the specs yourself when you're searching for them so that you can help identify something that is going to fit the need, as opposed to just going back to them and saying, I got nothing, I got nothing, I got nothing. The best agents in this business know how to put deals together because they think outside the box and they get creative and they have good conversations with their clients. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and if at any point, just, I can't see everybody's face now with this up, but, you know, just feel free to unmute if you have a question or throw it in the chat, whichever's more convenient. Okay, now I want it to move and I can't get it to move. Oh, my goodness, why is it doing that? Huh,
We're speed readers.
I don't know, guess so. I'm not even touching anything and it's just moving around. This
Hey, Paula, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I met this couple that they're in the market, they're looking to buy, but they are under agreement with another agent, but that agent is not doing anything for them. So they both told me that that agent their agreement ends, I guess, the first week in June.
So did they have a buyer rep
my-
agreement? Is that what they have, or what's the agreement?
I don't know what they have.
Huh?
Yes, that's the thing. I don't know what agreement they have, and they're not really forthcoming. But my question is, can I start sending them stuff and showing them stuff, or am I violating some?
Well, yeah, you run the chance. Well, you run a chance of putting your client in a bad position that they may owe that agent a commission as well.
Okay.
So you need to be clear what they mean by they're under contract with that agent. And if, you know, you can't interfere with a contract, but if they're unhappy, they should potentially be trying to cancel that contract out.
Yeah, that's what I tried to kind of push them towards to, and I said, you know, if you're happy, it's a contract, you can always get out of it. But they said, oh, we're just going to wait till it runs out, then we'll come with you.
Okay.
So I didn't want to be too pushy on it, but I didn't know if I could just start sending him stuff, or am I violating?
I wouldn't, it's not that you're violating anything, you're potentially putting them in a bad position of them having to owe money to that other agent as well.
Okay.
So you're better off, if they want to just run the contract out, then you're better off letting it run. And as it gets closer, you know, you can start to meet with them and pull stuff together, and you can put them under a buyer rep agreement that starts for when that one ends.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Good question. Okay, so showing the properties in today's market, I'm going to zip over here. Let's go into MLS just to make sure. Let me stop the share just for 1 second. Let me get over here to MLS. I want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of fields and what you're looking at in MLS PIN. All right, so I'm going to pull up, let me go back to screen share here for you. I'm going to pull up an MLS sheet. Okay, so, and again, this is just to make sure everybody knows in terms of what they're looking at in MLS. Some of you are newer than others, so some of you this might be a little more review, but just want to make sure we've sort of got everything covered. Okay. Oh, I lost my, hold on. Okay. All right, so when you're looking at the MLS, up here in the top, see how it says full report? Everybody see where my cursor is moving? So that's important because there's different versions of this, right? There's a public report that should be all you're ever sharing with the client. And the full report is going to give you all the information you need as an agent. So always make sure you're printing out and looking at the full report so that you have all the applicable information that you need. So one of the things we're going to look at in the full report that the clients wouldn't see on their copy if we scroll down are the showing instructions down here. Okay? And so it'll tell you what are the showing instructions if you want to show this property, lockbox, go direct. You link into schedule showing with showing time, so that gives you the ability to block off a showing. And then now with the COVID, if you look in the firm remarks, you'll see the tours. So like there's a Matterport tour, and then there's some instructions in there in terms of an offer. Okay, we want to make sure before you're running with anybody in this market You want to make sure the property is accessible. In other words, that you could get in if they wanted to get in. But you want to start by making sure your buyer looks at any of the virtual tours, any of the floor plans that are available, any of the goes through all the pictures. If you go back up here to the top, you know, you've got this sort of toolkit line here on the top right. And again, this little V that's all the way to the right here, that's a virtual tour link. Okay, if you go to the little paper clip, which there isn't one on here, so they don't have anything. If there's a paper clip, those are attached documents. So things like floor plans and stuff might be out there as well. So you want to make sure your client goes through, looks at all the pictures, make sure the house makes sense for them, looks at that tour before you even go down the path of bringing them into the house today based on
Oh, looks nice.
the COVID. This is a cute little property, yep.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't on mute, my bad.
No, that's okay. It's a cute little property. Okay. All good with that?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go back over here. We'll flip back and forth. I'm gonna get good at this. It did say see attachment. I didn't see the paper clip. That's okay. All right. So virtual tours, photos first. You know, what are my options? If my folks don't want to go into the property for safety reasons, then you could go in as the agent and FaceTime them in and do a walking tour with them with an iPad or with your phone and help them see the property sort of real time if they want that kind of connection, okay? In person, you wanna make sure you understand how the safety protocols are in place. So typically right now, and I think going forward, you'll see this with everything, masks, gloves, you should have some wipes available so that they can keep them in their hands in case they touch any closets or open things, then they're touching it with the wipe. Because even with the glove, if they're touching the glove and then they're touching stuff, you know, then they're potentially leaving fingerprints. So it's better to, leaving germ stuff behind. So it's better to have the gloves and the whole, sorry, the whole, oh, why? This is gonna drive me crazy. I'm gonna have to figure this out. I'm not even doing anything. You need to stop. It's like possessed tonight. Must be because it's the nighttime. You want to make sure you've got everything in place, you know, to do a safe showing. You don't assume your clients have stuff. Make sure you say to them, do you have your own mask that you're bringing? Do you have gloves? Or do you need me to bring some supplies for you? Okay. And or you can ask the listing agent, what safety measures do you want my clients and I to take to show the property? I have been getting some phone calls because some folks have been asking about an addendum to showing that listing agents are putting out there, and I do have a version to share with the office as well for stuff that we're doing. And that's really basically, it's a statement basically saying that, you know, if you're coming to the house, you're healthy, you're showing no signs of a fever, you know, you don't have any symptoms, because they don't want anybody that's potentially at risk to come in the house. And they're also typically going to ask you to limit the number of people to sort of the critical crowd, right? So like if the people want to come in, it doesn't need to be them, 4 sets of parents, 16 of their friends, 12 kids, right? You need to try to limit the number of people that are coming into that property and really try to keep it as minimal as you possibly can to just keep the safety in mind. Questions on showing? Make sure you use the tours, right? All that stuff's out there, and actually we're getting really good traction with that now. So communication is going to be key in this process with the agent. Okay, right from the get-go in terms of how you deal with that agent is going to set and sort of tone the rapport that you're building and set and tone the relationship you're building with that agent. And if your clients decide they want this property, that rapport could be critical, because in a multi-offer situation, you know, having good rapport with the agent so that the agent says, hey, I really want to work with you. Let's see if we can make this happen, because they feel like you're the person that's going to get the deal done. You're the one that's going to be reasonable to work with. I'm always shocked when an agent, and trust me, it happens all the time, you know, starts calling me and starts screaming at me as a listing agent over something that's like, first of all, nothing we should be screaming about. And second of all, in a situation where I think, I hope your client doesn't really want the house because I don't really want to work with you. And if there's other options on the table, that's going to be a factor. And that should be a factor the seller has to continue. You know, how reasonable is that buyer's agent to work with? Do they know how to keep a deal together, or are they a fire starter? Are they always asking for trouble and looking for trouble everywhere they go? if your client has some interest in the property, then you're going to want to start to ask some good questions of that agent. You know, when does the seller, what's their timeline look like? When would they like to move? Is there a seller's disclosure in lead paint? They may be in the attachments in MLS, so you might want to check there. If they're not there, then you would ask for it. And remember, on the lead paint form, we only need that if it's built 1978 or earlier. If it's built after 1978, we don't need a lead paint form at all. Seller's disclosure is basically a statement where the sellers just answer a bunch of questions about the property and improvements they've made, any issues that they've had, and how they've addressed those issues. And so that's good information from the buyers as they're making their decision to put in an offer.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to get to this at some point. If you are, that's fine. So I have a client. We started looking last weekend, and I've seen a couple of listings that say no contingency offers will be considered.
Yeah. Well, they can say that. Doesn't mean that's what they're going to get. That basically means they're saying they're not going to take an offer that has a home inspection and or mortgage contingency in it.
Right. Which doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, in some of the markets, it doesn't make any sense to me that why they would put that in the offer like that, because first of all, that's probably not something the seller said. It's probably something the agent's saying, and that's really interfering with potential offers that could come in. So that's harming the seller, if anything. You know, I open the door and see what comes through it and then work from there. They may be considering that in wherever that property is and for the way they priced it, they think they're going to have enough options that they don't have to consider those. I personally think that's a silly thing to put in there, you know, because again, if I had a really strong buyer with a really strong approval, but still wanted some kind of mortgage contingency, what are they losing out on? They're losing out on potentially even reviewing that particular offer because the agent put that out there. To me, that's not really smart. That's not really looking out for your seller's best interest. What market was that in, Tim?
She's on South Shore. So like Brockton, Randolph. I think both of them were actually in Brockton.
That's kind of surprising because that market's not that hot.
Well, I know, and I mean, we're not, you know, she's got a good but not great budget, and so I'm like, really, for 310, you're putting in no contingencies?
Well, again, if you write an offer, the selling agent is obligated under their license law to present that offer. So I don't know if it was sitting on the market for any length of time, I still might write an offer and submit it. But that's either the sign of a very unreasonable seller with unrealistic expectations and or an unreasonable listing agent with unreasonable expectations. But somebody in that deal's not making a great decision.
Yeah, and her mortgage company that she's working with requires me, because I'm an outside agent, to go through a 2-hour tutorial, which I did. And then a few other things, which I'm going to be doing this week.
Okay.
And in the 2-hour tutorial, they're saying that they have mandatory contingencies. They have inspection. They have the.
Well, is she coming out a certain kind of program then?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's fine. I mean, that's kind of an odd situation just because it's a certain kind of program, but requesting no contingencies is I think a little bit of a suicide mission. But that's, you know. Agents will do what agents will do, right? So the other thing I need to know is, are there any other offers on the table, right? What kind of traffic has there been? It's a lot harder in this market to gauge the traffic because in normal conditions, when our old conditions, I should say, because who knows what normal is right now. But in our old conditions, the houses would be open. It would be open house. We'd get to see that, 50 people came through the open house. And so you can kind of gauge from that there's extreme interest in this, the way it's priced, and for the type of property and how the pictures show. We don't necessarily get the benefit of that in this market. You do typically see, an agent's typically booking appointments back to back to back. So you can kind of see, is there anybody booked around me? So if they're not, maybe there aren't as many showings, or that just could be based on calendar and what the agent's trying to do. But it's important to know before I have that conversation with my client, are there any other offers on the table, and or has there been some interest expressed, so I know what the timing is of what I need to do. Okay? Now, again, you're going to take it with a grain of salt what that agent says. If they say, well, we've had a lot of interest, we don't have any offers on the table, we got them coming in. That if they don't have them on the table, they don't have them on the table. So that's part of your consideration when you're actually writing the offer. So what kind of information do you need to pull prior to making the offer? Well, obviously, we need to be very careful to look at MLS, okay? And I'm going to start with some of the basics, really, before I dive into the stuff on the screen. What kind of things do we need to be careful of when we're making an offer on the house is, first, what is included and excluded in that property? So you want to look in MLS at the inclusions and the exclusions. So, you know, again, anything that's not a fixture, so things like the refrigerator, the washer dryer, you know, the shed out back, the swing set, you know, anything that's not considered a fixture like that are things that you need to take into account potentially writing in the offer if your client wants those. And then take a look at the exclusions in MLS, because maybe the dining room chandelier has been excluded because it's a family heirloom, right? And you want to know that so that you can have that conversation with your buyers, whether, well, is that going to work for us? Are we okay with excluding that, or do we want it and we need to write it in? Okay? But you need to make sure you understand what's included and what's excluded. What are the expectations of what will stay and what will go? You want to know who owns the house, because if you're writing an offer, you need to know who the sellers are, and you can find that on the public records in MLS. If you go and you're looking at the MLS sheet and you click up on the right-hand corner on that, it's like an open folded book, that will go into the public records. Or if you go to Tools in MLS and then go to Public Records, you can also put in the address and get at it that way. So who owns the house? You know, what does the assessed value look like? Your clients may be looking for tax and insurance information. You're going to want to know, going to want a copy of the deed. Now, as a buyer's agent, here's why the deed's important. Well, let me back up. You get the deed by going to the Registry of Deeds, and you can do that online. Okay? So you can go to the Registry of Deeds, do a document search, look for the deed on the property. And here's why you want a copy of the deed and you want to know the information on there. Because the person that's on the deed, person or persons on the deed, are who needs to sign your offer in order to make your offer a legal contract. So if you put an offer in and you put Jack Smith on the offer, but Jack and Jane Smith own the property, you need to make sure you know that, so Jack and Jane Smith need to sign the offer. An offer that's just signed by Jack Smith potentially is not enforceable in court, and you'd have a lot of problems if you went forward and made assumptions that you had a deal. Okay? As a buyer's agent, you should be careful to make sure that you're doing your research. So, what improvements have been made to the house? Were permits pulled? Were permits closed? You know, doing a quick search at the building department to make sure everything was documented the right way, whether you do it or your buyers do it. But that's important information to make sure, you know, open permits or improvements where permits were never pulled can be a huge problem down the line. So you want to identify any of those issues up front as soon as you can, sooner than later. If not now, before the offer, between the offer and the purchase and sale, so that you know if something needs to be addressed, it can be addressed in the purchase and sale. Knowing when the house was purchased and for what price. Now, again, I want to be clear about this because I don't want you to mistake this information. This does not mean that that drives the value of the house, but it can be important information, because if they bought the house 3 months ago and they paid $200,000 less for it, what does that tell you? Well, they bought it and they did work to it and they're flipping it. So it kind of can give you the scenario of that property that you may or may not know. Okay? And again, what somebody paid for it, it doesn't necessarily mean what it's worth, but it can give you a gauge of timing and what did happen. What the house is worth is based on strictly the comparables. Supply and demand and comparables at that time. Don't fall into the trap of saying to your client, well, the house isn't worth that because they shouldn't be getting an extra $100,000 out of it just in the last 5 years, because there's a lot of properties out there that do just that. Not all the time, but in this market that we're coming out of, that's been happening, you know, and depending on the market and timing and when they bought, they might be pulling a lot of equity out at this point. What's the condition and age of the house? Obviously, that plays into the value. How long has it been on the market? So is this a new listing that just came on, and so it's potentially a competitive situation with multiple offers because it just hit the market this weekend and there's all kinds of activity? Or is this a property that's been on the market for 7, 30, 60 days? Right? That timeline can become very important in showing you value and or what you should be writing an offer for. Something's been sitting on the market for 60 days, it's most likely overpriced, right? And so that means there's some room for negotiation. If it just recently had a big, huge price change and now it's got a lot of traffic, now that might be like a new listing because it's driven into the right price range. You might end up back in a competitive situation. The local market data is really just the comparables. We want to know what that market looks like and what do the comparables look like. So is this price reasonable for the house? Is it priced under with the hope that they'll drive it high? Is it priced at market value? Is it priced over and maybe we need to come in under anyway? So running the comps can give us a base and some information. Be careful in the market we're in currently and where we've been, because a lot of times agents will say, well, the house isn't worth that, but it is because somebody's coming to the table and writing a check for that. And when you're getting competitive situations, sometimes things are going for what the perceived value could be calculated at, doesn't mean the value isn't there.
Paula, for the comparables, are you looking at a neighborhood? Are you looking at the same street, a couple streets over? Like, where do you draw the line on what is considered a comparable in terms of area?
It's a good question, Ashley. So, similar to what I do in the pricing workshop, it's good to look at immediate surrounding area to start. Is this a $500,000 house and there's nothing in that price range within a mile? We might have a problem, right? We're either the best house in the whole block and we don't necessarily want to be that, or the house is immensely overpriced. But you want to be also comparing apples to apples. So, if this is a 4-bed colonial in a really nice neighborhood, it's worth more than a 4-bedroom colonial that's on the main street, right?
Gotcha.
And so you can tend to gauge against those as well. Does that help?
Yeah, and is it worth it to look at also properties that just sold, or properties, or are you only looking at properties currently on the market?
Nope, solds are very important. So all the categories are actually important. The actives are telling you the competition, what you're up against, right? But they may not be priced properly.
Okay.
The under agreements are telling you what price worked and the house finally went under contract for, but you don't know what they got.
Gotcha.
And the solds are telling you what they got.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you run into a situation in this market right now where there aren't a lot of comparables to compare to?
That can be the case. It can be tricky because of the lack of inventory, yes. Keep in mind in some markets, and actually that brings up a good point that I had forgotten to mention, keep in mind in some of these markets, there's some stuff that's going under contract that's not hitting the market, so it's not necessarily in MLS. And if you know you're in an area like that, you might want to go into public records and look at the street. When you look at the public records, there's actually a field there for date last sold. So sometimes, okay, well, this neighborhood recently had a lot of sales, but none of them went through MLS. They were all private sales. So I'm going to look at the street in the public records under the tools, and I'm going to sort that by date sold, last date sold, so I can take a look at the ones that sold that aren't necessarily on MLS. So that can be sort of added research. And again, I mean, you can do that anyway. You don't typically, that's not typically usually our first line of defense. It's a good place to go. Anything else on sort of gathering the information? What else is important? I need to know, I need to have my buyer's pre-approval letter, which I should already have in my file, right? I should already have my agency disclosure form in my file because I got that signed at my first face-to-face or before when I started showing property to these folks. I'm not getting it signed at the offer. I should have had that already signed. So I have my agency disclosure and I have my pre-approval letter already ready to go. What else I'll need for the offer is the offer to purchase, the offer to purchase contingency addendum, and a copy of the first good faith check, the offer deposit check. And then that whole package is what's going to go over to the listing agent when I submit that offer. So we'll be talking about that again in a little bit. Okay? Any other questions on other information before making an offer? What do you think some of the good questions are to ask the client before we write up the offer?
Hey, Paula, I have a question.
Sure.
When you talk about the pre-approval, I think in the earlier meeting, you talked about you have to have them within 3 weeks or dated within the last 3 weeks or something like that. Is that?
So in this market, because it's changing so much, this is a little unusual in terms of timing. You do want to make sure your clients have an updated pre-approval, like definitely not anything older than 30 days, but maybe even shorter than that.
Okay.
Because the terms and stuff have changed, in terms of what they need for credit score, the programs have changed. So if they don't have that, you can either call the mortgage broker and say, look, could you send me over a quick updated letter for them? Are all the qualifications still okay? Do they still qualify for the 450 we talked about? Because they're getting ready to put an offer in. And there's one other question I'll address at this point too, so I don't forget. And that has to do with, I get this question all the time. My people are approved for 450,000, but we're making an offer at 400,000. Should I use the 450 letter or should I get a letter for the 400,000? So there's different schools of thought on that. A lot of folks will say to you, get the updated letter because otherwise you're showing your hand that your people can afford 450. I tend to go on the school of thought where it doesn't matter what my people can afford, they're going to offer what the house is worth to them, right? What 450 is showing you is that they are actually a strong buyer. It's not telling you that we're going to pay 450 for this house because this house might not be worth 450. But if we put a $400,000 offer in on your house, that tells you with a 450 approval letter that I actually have a buyer that can afford more and is a stronger buyer, so that maybe if an appraisal issue or something comes up, they may have a little wiggle room there and may not have a problem. Okay, but you can really, there's not a right or a wrong there. It's just an opinion. All right, let's talk about the offer itself. Now, how do I want to do this? I'm going to go through the timeline with you this way, and then what I'll do is I'll pop into an offer form and show you how that ties to the offer, okay? Because I think it's important to have a bigger picture of the timeline so that you can set the client up properly through the steps. Just so you know too, in all the offices, we have a brochure. It's a 4-page brochure. It's also available on our site digitally on the commonresources.org. I think it's in the under the digital materials. There's a home guide to buying a home in Massachusetts. And it actually is a really good, nice quality brochure that outlines this timeline in there for your clients. So when you're sitting down and talking to them about this ahead of time, which hopefully you've done, they can also kind of see how this is going to play out from the day we put the offer in to what they need for money and what those steps are. Okay, and I'll also share the slides with this after I do this recording. I'll have the slides in there with the recording as well if you want the slides.
Paula, where did you say the brochure is again?
So it is, we keep them in the office, and the digital copy, if I'm trying to remember correctly, I'm pretty sure it's in commonresources.org.
Okay.
And there's a section, I'm trying to think if it's in another section, but it'll say digital brochures.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So here we are, today's day 1, right? So today is April 29th, and we're putting in an offer. And typically with an offer, there needs to be good faith money, right? So for backing up 1 second, in Massachusetts, we're a 2-step process. So we do an offer, and then we do a purchase and sales agreement. Okay, that not all states do real estate that way. But we are a 2-contract state, or 2-step process. So first we're going to do the offer, and typically there is good faith money put in with that offer. And the majority of the time, you will see that that is $1,000 with the offer. Can it be less? Can it be like $500 because it's a low-priced property? Yes. Can it be lower because your client only has that amount of money? Yes, but you'd want to explain that to the listing agent what the issue is. Can it be higher than that? Yes, because we may want to show a strong face forward in faith of moving forward into the contract by putting more money down with that offer. Okay? Most common question that comes up at this stage is my money at risk? So if I sign this offer and I give you this $1,000 check, am I going to lose this $1,000 check if I don't end up buying this house? And the answer is not. If you have contingencies, you will not, potentially. Potentially. So we're going to have some potential contingencies built into the offer, and whether we go forward or not with that will determine whether we have a release signed and get that money back, or whether we move forward into the transaction and move one step closer to actually closing the deal. Okay, so typically, again, from a timeline, day 2, let's say the offer is accepted, we've gone back and forth, we've gotten the offer updated, now it's been signed, it's been fully executed. Your clients are then going to hire a home inspector right away if they're doing a home inspection. And typically that home inspection contingency in the offer is going to cover you from somewhere to 7 to 10 days. And again, that's just the average, that's the typical. Sometimes it's faster because you want to show that you'll move faster because it's a competitive situation, but typically it's going to run between that 7 and 10 day period. You'll get them in before that. Your contingency will end in that time frame. So you're trying to book the home inspection for as quickly as possible. If you're doing radon inspection, again, you want to get that radon can, if you're doing a radon can in the house as quickly as possible, because that has to be in the house for 48 hours before it gets picked up and sent into a lab and evaluated. And there's 2 types of home inspection options. There's the radon cans where they leave them, which is the least expensive option and just as effective. And then they have a machine that you can hire to leave in the property. I think they leave it in for 24 hours and it gives them a continuous reading of the radon so that you get the results for that right away. Okay, so either one of those options can be done to get radon results. As this is going forward, you're always getting an attorney involved. We strongly recommend you always have an attorney involved in Massachusetts. Again, not an absolute requirement, but from my standpoint, I don't do deals without them because the attorney's going to help draft and review that purchase and sales contract and help through the legal process get you all the way through that close.
Do we have attorneys that we would recommend to our buyers, or do we expect them to find their own?
You can do that, yep. What office are you out of, Tim?
Yours.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Been
I haven't seen you in a while.
Been a very long day. Scott Sellers from Horning and Simone works out of our office and does a phenomenal job. So he's very good. I can pass on his information. Occasionally you'll meet other attorneys, so you'll have a few in your repertoire that you can pass on, but you can feel free to recommend someone. It's nice to recommend someone you know is thorough and good with the clients and will keep the deal on track. If a client ever comes to the table and says, well, I'm going to use my cousin Joe to do the deal, you know, obviously they have a choice, but I would make sure cousin Joe's actually a real estate attorney and not like a divorce attorney trying to do a real estate deal. Because if you've done any real estate deals lately, you know that these attorneys put all their own addendums in. There's so many components that if they're not used to a real estate transaction, it's really a waste of time to pull them in. It's much better. I would highly recommend a real estate attorney, and usually most of your clients will ask for a good recommendation. Okay? And then when we get into that 10 to 14 days, we get that good purchase and sales done by the attorney. We're going to actually sign the purchase and sales agreement. Now, typically, the buyer signs the purchase and sales agreement first and then writes the check for the additional deposit, which usually the full good faith money equals 5% of the deal. Again, can be more, can be less, depending on the scenario. Maybe they don't have 5%. Maybe they're mortgaging, you know, maybe they're putting 3.5% down and mortgaging the rest of it, so they have less money to put down. That's fine. But the typical or the bigger, you know, the majority of them you'll see come in at 5%. Now, this, I want to be clear with this because this is the place where I see 90% of the errors with new agents and or folks that aren't paying attention when they do their contracts. This is not their mortgage amount. So if they're putting 20% down to buy the house, you do not need to put 20% down with the purchase and sales agreement, because this money that's being put with this contract is at risk potentially, right? We have contingencies to protect it, but that still potentially could be at-risk money. There's no reason to put full 20% down, especially if it wasn't competitive or, you know, and put all that money at risk if a problem was going to arise. So just be careful. There's a difference between good faith money and what they're actually putting down to close the property. Does that make sense? It's clear, I guess. I'd like to stress it because that's probably the biggest area when I'm reviewing contracts for folks. It's the hardest thing to sometimes grasp sometimes. And a lot of times I'll see 20% down with the P&S. I'm like, oh, no. We don't need to put that much money at risk. So right when they do the purchase and sale is when they officially submit their mortgage application. And again, that doesn't mean they haven't been working with the mortgage broker. They haven't been getting their paperwork in. That's when the mortgage company will actually launch the application, because they'll take that purchase and sale as the first document going in to move forward with the transaction. So the official application typically goes in right at the purchase and sale execution. The next thing that's going to happen that's not on here is that an appraiser will typically go out to the property and appraise the property for the bank to determine. So the bank has pre-approved your client and said they're worthy of $450,000 for a mortgage, but now the bank also has to approve that house. So they have to say that house is also worth the money that we're going to put into it. They're not just going to give you the money for any property, okay? So they do an appraisal to now verify that the house is worthy of the money that they're gonna put into the transaction. And once they do that and they run all your paperwork, and again, the buyer's gonna need to stay on top of everything. They're gonna need to send in tax documents, pay stubs. They're gonna have to update all that stuff. Make sure your clients understand how important it is to keep on top of that with the mortgage broker. Then the mortgage lender will issue what we call a mortgage commitment. They will commit to the buyer, we will give you that money, we will give you an 80% mortgage on this house with your terms, as long as nothing changes between now and the closing date. Okay, so that's called the commitment date. That's sort of the end of the contingencies, right? So there's two potential passes at contingencies, unless there's additional things written in, and that's a home inspection contingency that says it passes our home inspection for the things we can't see. There's no big major structural issues, no big problems that would be unforeseen that we might not be able to afford. We get past that, we sign the P&S. Once we sign the P&S, we got to get past the mortgage contingency and know that we have a commitment to move forward in with the loan to actually get to the closing. Okay? In this process, the buyer's going to obtain a home insurance binder for the closing. Again, the mortgage company is typically driving that process with them and letting them know, hey, by the way, here's the information you need. Please go secure and pay for a insurance binder for the house so that we can go forward with the closing. And then you're going to, as a buyer's agent, you're going to make sure that they do a walkthrough right before the closing, either the day right before or the day of the closing if the closing's first thing in the morning. And you're going to do that closing right after that, okay? Now, on the closing piece and the walkthrough piece, the walkthrough as an agent, a lot of times people will call me, what am I supposed to do? The walkthrough is a verification that when your client's taking possession of the property, it's in the state you would expect it to. You know, and people ask why? Well, water pipes burst. Maybe the people moved out 2 weeks ago and a water pipe burst. There have been fires in between the last time somebody saw their property and the closing. And so that needs to be addressed. If they go to the closing table and sign on that, they potentially could have a problem. So you're doing a sort of a certification that it is what we expected it to be. It's in the same shape. If the people have moved out, it's been left in reasonable shape. You know, the walls aren't now gouged out, or there aren't holes, places, or doors missing, or things. You know, it's in the same condition when we committed to buy the property, okay? And then you're gonna pass what they call passing papers is the closing, and that's the attorney going through, the attorney for the bank, which is typically a lot of times the buyer's attorney, will go through all the paperwork with them that the bank is requiring for them to commit to that loan. And then the sellers will sign some paperwork, which includes signing a deed, which transfers that ownership of the property over to the new owners. And that can take place anywhere really, this says 40 to 60 days. It can really take place anywhere from 30 days on, right? 30 days is tight, especially even in today's market. 30 days is really tight. If financing is involved, you might have a faster closing if there's no financing involved. But with financing involved, anything like under 45 days, I would say make sure you talk to that lender and say, look, are we okay closing this in 30 days or 35 days? Because that's what the seller really wants. And a lot of times if the lender knows that, then they'll make sure the appraisal gets ordered right away and stay on top of it to make sure that you can actually get to that closing table. In today's world, COVID world, you're not actually typically allowed at the closings today because they are limited contact, limited number of people in a crowd. You know, I'll call it the old days now because that's what it is. We used to sometimes go to the closing, sit at the closing table, have our clients sign it. A lot of times now the buyers and sellers will give power of attorney to the attorneys to do the closing, and they'll pre-sign the deeds and things that they need to sign so that they might, the buyers and sellers may not even be at the closing. It's just the attorneys taking care of paperwork and passing it back and forth. And when those closings take place, they don't need the agent unless you have paperwork or something that you need to drop off for the closing or you're trying to pick up a check, okay? Now the closings are typically in parking lots, you know, or out. I've seen some in garages, outside shelters, sitting apart from each other. Massachusetts just did pass the, I think they're calling it the virtual notarization. So I think what that's allowing for is the virtual notary of important documents like that for closings. So we may even see even less contact. But again, they are not going to want you as an agent at the closing itself right now because they are limiting the number of people that come. So be aware of that. Some of the other components in the, or some of the other specifications in the offer that, just to take a peek at, and then I'm going to flip over to the offer here in a second. The property description, I'll go through when we flip over to the offer, but a lot of times you want to really reference, you want to be careful in the offer that you reference the right and legal property address, because again, this is a legal contract. So be careful to make sure you've got the full address. Make sure you reference the MLS number so that it pulls in the MLS specs into the offer. You're typically going to reference what type of property is. You know, we know we're buying a condo. We know we're buying a 3-family dwelling at X and X address. And then the other reason why you pull the deed is you'll know where the deed has been filed so that you can reference the registry and book and page that that deed is actually filed in. Okay, so that actually pulls the deed into the deal as well. Special provisions in the offer, again, that ties into the MLS sheet. I'll go over that when I go through it. Let me see what else on here. I'll do this stuff as I go through, if there's anything else. 7 days. Yeah, let me go over, I'm gonna go over to the offer.
Hey, Paula.
Yep.
This is Catherine Smith. Before you move on, may I ask you just a question?
Sure.
Oh, thank you. So I just moved here from Kentucky. I'm a broker in Kentucky, and I haven't done a deal in Massachusetts yet.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to wrap my head just visually around what these purchase contracts look like. So in Kentucky, we just do it all at once, right? There's a purchase and sale agreement, and the purchase and sale agreement stays that purchase and sale agreement. An attorney typically does not get involved unless there's an issue that is particular, let's say, to an addendum, you know, where somebody actually needs to write something and modify that contract. And that is really just to keep the deal moving and keep the expenses down for the buyer and the seller. So, so on this two-step offer, is the offer like a letter of intent, a separate document from the purchase contract?
Yeah, it's a separate document. We're going to go in right now, and I'll show you what it takes to look like. It's you know, the context is like a letter of intent, but it's a full contract.
Okay.
Okay. Let me go into.
Can I find that like on a dot loop or something to pick?
Yeah, it's in dot loop, which is I'm going to show you. I'm going to screen share with you right now here in 2 seconds.
Interesting.
Give me 1 second.
And your deposits are amazing too. I just sold a little over $500,000 home in Kentucky, which is a pretty decent deal for that area. Mm-hmm. And I had to fight with the listing agent to say I want $5,000 from the buyer. It's just 1%. So that's incredible.
All right, give me one. Actually, I'll show you this piece because I'll make sure. Let me go back to screen share here. Screen share, dot loop. So all our documents are in dot loop, right?
Okay.
This is what we use for all our contracts. We're a paperless company, so it's also where everything gets submitted. You go into dot loop. My dot loop might look a little different than yours just because I'm on the admin side, so just bear with me, but from the forms, it'll be the same. So, you know, I clicked on add document. I have an option of either going to the template or go into browse the documents individually. If I knew I was going to make an offer, I might want to go into the template and go in under the offer sales form so that I can see the various forms and pick and choose what I'm looking for. Okay. In this case, I'm going to pick the Coveted Addendum because we're in COVID. I'm going to pick what's called the TRID Addendum, but it's called in here, it's called the Addendum for Integrated Disclosure. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to pick the offer to purchase real estate and the offer to purchase contingency addendum. And I'm going to pull those in. Now, let me go into the forms. Start with the offer to purchase real estate. Now, there are two, this will give you an opportunity to put some information. If you want it to auto-populate, you can do that. I'm just going to go right into the offer so we don't confuse things here. But there are two different forms in Massachusetts that you're going to see. There's the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, which is what a lot of our territory uses. And that's a two-component form. It's the offer to purchase real estate and the offer to purchase contingency addendum. Okay? There is a different version of the form called the MAR, or the Massachusetts Association of Realtor form. That's just as acceptable. It has the contingencies built right into the form. So in that case, it's just the one form. Greater Boston Real Estate Board, you see mostly used, I'd say 128 belt, 95, 128 belt into the city. And once you go west of there, you tend to see the MAR form more. But there's not a right or a wrong here, okay? Not a right or wrong. In the end, they're all the same information. They're just presented a little differently.
And I guess like a MAR form would be if you had a person who's not a realtor.
That's correct. That's all they'd have access to. Yeah, typically. But again, the forms are pretty readily accessible. So, all right, let me.
I've got a question,
Sure.
Paula.
Sure.
I've heard that a lot of people prefer the MAR firm over the Greater Boston one, but that we're strongly advised to use the Greater Boston one. Is there?
So nobody's strongly advising anything. First off, you can use either form. And again, you'll have some agents that freak out. Why are you giving me an offer on that form? We're not used to that form because you're out of territory more than anything. There are some things, and as I go through this form, I'll tell you, the MAR form's a little more condensed, and there's a couple of advantages. I think they're advantages. Other people think they're disadvantages. So I'll point out a couple of those differences as I go through the two, okay? We're not strongly advising you use one. As a majority in my 3 offices, we're using the Greater Boston Real Estate Board form because of the territory we're covering.
Can I ask you another quick question? This is Catherine.
Yeah.
So again, kind of a lot of things come down to custom, right? In our market, it's not atypical to make an offer and say, you know, the deposit or the will be made upon acceptance of offer. That way people aren't having to write a bunch of checks. Is that acceptable here, or does the $1,000 typically always?
As I go through this, Catherine. What office are you out of?
Winchester.
Okay. Yeah, let me go through it as I go through this. I know where you're heading with that. We'll talk about that as we go through this.
This is a Kentucky custom.
And again, I don't really want to talk about Kentucky because I'm in Massachusetts.
No, I know that, but I'm just trying to compare and contrast.
I'll give you the equivalent here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you the equivalent here. So, okay, so let's take a look at this offer. I'm going to go through this offer and fill this out. I want to have looked up the seller so that I can address them by name. Okay. You'll see on a lot of offers, it says owner of record. Again, the reason I like to see the Mr. and Mrs. Seller, because I know you've looked at the deed and I know that you know the right parties have signed your offer when you're finished. Okay. And again, you're looking out for your client's best interest. So do the research and spend the time. Don't cut corners and potentially put your client at risk. And then their address, whatever their address is. Okay. We're going to fill that in. We're going to put in up here, we're going to date the offer. You want to make sure it is a contract, so the dates are important. So I want to make sure I have the dates in there. The Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Commonwealth Real Estate will populate for you in there. Okay. In here, we're going to put the full property address. So I'm going to put, it's a single family home at 100 Main Street, Andover, Mass. Oh no. further referenced in Middlesex County Registry book, whatever the book number is, page, and this is referencing the deed, where the original deed for these owners that currently own the property, and listed in MLS number, and put in the MLS number, whatever that MLS number is, okay? And so here's what I'm doing by doing that. I'm pulling in the MLS record and terms, the things that they've said were included and excluded into the deal, and I'm making it sort of a reference that this is how we found the property. So there's a lot of times people will say, oh, this wasn't clear in the offer, but it was clear in MLS. And so if I pull the MLS in, that helps sort of further identify the intent of the contract, okay? And then the book and page help you identify the deed, which has the physical description and legal description of the property on it as well. You know, so again, you know that that's being pulled into the process. The reason I keep stressing the legal address, and again, this would tie to the deed, you know, interestingly enough, I sold a house in Westford probably good 10 years ago now, but we actually had listed the house as the property plus an adjacent lot that was going with the property, and that's how the property was priced. The people wrote up the offer. They never referenced the lot. The purchase and sale was done. Nobody ever referenced the lot. We got to the closing, and the buyer said, what about the lot? And the seller's attorney said, it wasn't part of the deal. So, you know, in that case, we worked it out. But again, that opened the door to potentially that the buyer was not getting what they thought they were getting because the contracts were never drawn up properly. So be careful of little things like that. You know, if the address is 8-10, or if the address is multiple buildings, make sure it includes all of those addresses, okay? It sounds like a minute point, and it's not that it's gonna be a common occurrence, but those couple occurrences where it is gonna come up could cause a lot of problems. Special provisions, fixtures, appliances. So again, this is where you want to reference the MLS, what's being included, the refrigerator, the washer and dryer are staying. You know, maybe they're, again, refrigerator, washer, dryer, right? You need to be clear and clarify that. You don't have to get into stoves, microwaves that are attached, because those are all fixtures. But, you know, and maybe the backyard swing set is staying. Okay, now I can include things that the seller has said they would like to not include. That means I might not get the deal and I might not get what I'm asking for, but I can ask for them in the deal. So just because the seller says the washer, dryer, refrigerator are excluded, and the buyer's saying, well, at that price, I want them, well, then write it in the offer, and it becomes part of the negotiation. You'll be negotiating all the terms. Okay, the property is being offered to you by. This is not your name. If you look underneath here, it actually says the brokers. So you're going to put the company name, BHHS Commonwealth. And then you would typically also put the listing brokerage name. So, you know, Caldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Joe Schmo's Brokerage, whatever the listing brokerage name is. Because those are now the two brokers that are party to this transaction. Then we're going to go down. The next field here is the offer price. So how much are we offering on the house? We're going to put in an offer for $450,000. Okay? This first line is that deposit that I talked about with the offer. That's typically $1,000 unless we decided we're going to do something different. Okay? Second deposit is that second deposit that goes with the purchase and sale. What did we say that usually is?
5%.
Correct. So let me do a quick calculation here. My dog is snoring so loud, it's making me laugh. He's such a snorer. All right, 450,000 times 5% is 22,500. We've already put 1,000 on here, so I'll put 21,500 for the purchase and sale deposit.
Gotcha.
Okay, now I can do some math, or you can take Paula's lazy way and put in balance here of basically that the rest is going to be due at the signing at the closing, okay? And there's other lines here just in case. Sometimes in a new construction or different scenarios. Maybe your client isn't going to have 5% at the purchase and sale, but 2 weeks later they can put additional money down and they're willing to do that. You know, there's other scenarios that might come into play. That's why you have an extra line to work with, but it doesn't get used very often. On the right side, go ahead.
The C where you put balance, that's closing, right?
That's at the closing table,
Okay.
correct? Yeah, delivery of deed would be the same thing as the closing.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yep, on the right here where it says check one, it's always a check. We never, ever, 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 ever take cash from our buyers for an offer or purchase and sale. We don't accept it as a company. You should not accept it as an agent because that's a very high risk.
Yeah.
Why? What if they hand you $900 and tell you there's $1,000 in the pack and you walk away? That's now on you. Always a check. If they don't have a checking account, tell them to go to the bank and get a bank check. Just don't take cash. Okay, and don't you take the cash and go to the bank and get the bank check. It's best if they handle that. So make sure you get a check for the deposits, and we'll talk about who those are made out to in just a second as we go further down here. So now the offer, when is the offer good until? Well, today's the night of the 29th. I'm writing this with you. It's a fairly competitive situation, and so in this case, I'm probably only going to give you a day to look at this with your seller. I don't want to, you know, lose out. So I'm going to, my calendar's floating around where you guys are hanging out. Let me see if I can move you guys over here. There we go. That's even better. Okay. So I'm only going to put till tomorrow, and maybe I'm going to put 12 noon. Okay. But again, that's part of what you're going to put there is based really kind of on strategy, right? It's going to be strategic based on what the terms are. Maybe if they're reviewing multiple offers, they've said, please make offers good until Tuesday at 5, so you'll follow those instructions. Maybe you're trying to force their hand because you have such a strong offer, and so you might give them even less time, right? So there's a lot of strategy that goes into the timing of when they are going to execute this offer, when it's good until. How long did I say we typically go out for the purchase and sale? Who remembers that one?
10 to 14 days? No?
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So let me look at the calendar here. We want to make sure you're always referencing the calendar because you don't want to write in Saturday and Sundays. So don't just pick dates, right? But if we go out to the calendar, we can see that, you know, we're at the end of the month here. I don't know. Why is the calendar coming out so far down? If I go to May, you know, we're here in the 30th, so 10 to 14 days would put me somewhere around May 13th. And typically for the purchase and sales, I'm going to put like into the evening, 6 o'clock or maybe even 8 p.m. just so we don't run out of time that day if we're trying to get the document signed by multiple people. So I usually put the end of the day.
So, and that time frame is business days, correct?
That's correct. This is always, yeah. Well, yeah, 10 to 14 business days, or I say 10 to 14 days, meaning calendar days actually, not business days typically from the time frame, but make sure your days that you're utilizing here make sense from a business standpoint. When are we looking to close? How far out did we say? Well, typically, again, 30 plus days, maybe 45 days out. And in this particular case, maybe our buyer and seller are both saying that mid-June works best, so we're going to close on June 12th. Okay?
And
again,
I'm just curious, Paula, how do you actually determine when you're going to close? Because isn't part of that up to the bank? Like, what if there's a stall with the bank or something? How do you put in that date?
Okay, so we want to put in what we might be paying rent and we might need to move by a certain date. The sellers may be moving into another property, so they have a date. So the buyers and sellers kind of drive that process. Obviously, the bank is going to try to comply with them. Like if you said to the bank, we got to close in 3 weeks because of a move, they may say to you, well, that might be tight. We can try, but you may need an extension. Okay?
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
this is typically sort of what makes the most sense for the buyers and sellers and what they want. You can see this might even be out further. Like we've got some offers coming through now that are July or August because people are going under contract, but they don't want to move until the end of the summer.
Gotcha.
Whatever the scenario is.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. The next one here, number 5, is actually who's going to hold the escrow money. So who's holding this $1,000 and $21,000 check? And the majority of the time, that's going to be the listing company. So I think I put the listing companies as listing brokerage name. So whatever that company name is, right, is typically going to hold the escrow. Now, doesn't have to be 100% of the time. There are instances, there are brokerages out there that don't have escrow accounts and don't hold escrow. And so they'll tell you, we don't hold escrow. And so in that case, you could put our company, the buyer's company can hold it because we have an escrow account. So it can always be Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Commonwealth. And it can also be an attorney that has an escrow account that's part of the deal. Those are the 3 acceptable offers, options for where that escrow money can go. Okay? Then down here, additional riders, if any, and additional terms. So what are some of the things we're going to see down here? The most common right now, and with this form, the first one is offer to purchase contingency addendum, because we're going to attach the contingency addendum, right? We want to make it part of this document, okay? We are most likely attaching what we call the integrated, it's called the TRID addendum. I'll pull it that. Everybody kind of knows what it is if you put the TRID addendum, but that's that integrated mortgage disclosure. I'll show you. All that's needed on there is a signature. That basically means that all the parties are going to comply with the TRID law. So if there's some kind of delay in the closing because of the TRID law, that people are okay with that and everybody will cooperate. I'm going to reference the Coveted Addendum because I'm going to bring the Coveted Addendum in to this document, okay? One of the other addendums I might have, if it's a condo, I need to do a condominium document addendum because I want to have time for the attorneys to review the financial documents. Document review addendum. I want the attorneys in the deal to have the time to review any condo docs, master deeds, budgets, financials, to make sure that everything's in line there.
Is this also where you would put, like you said, in the packet you're sending over, the pre-approval letter and the agency disclosure?
So good question. I don't have to reference them in here because they're not technically part of the contract. They're just part of the package I'm sending over.
Okay, but they don't need to be referenced there, but they're in the packet. Okay.
Correct. Yep, good question. I also could put other things here that I'm concerned about. So maybe the place is a disaster zone and there's a lot of trash in the property. So we want the property to be delivered free and clear of all trash and personal property. Because we're concerned that these people aren't going to move out. Again, not something you see all the time, but if you have concerns or anything that needs to be addressed, you would put it in here. Okay, now maybe your buyer needs a home sale contingency. Yes, Andy's asking if I can PDF this to you and send it to you after. I can do that to you. I'll take a list at the end of the class, remind me. Maybe my buyer needs to close on his property in order to actually get this house. So I might say, no, why did that do that? My computer has a mind of its own tonight. Somebody is totally messing with me online. Sales subject to closing of buyer's property at 12 East Street, Boston, prior to close. Okay. And again, anything, when you start to get into this kind of language, this is typically an area where you would maybe talk to the attorney and say, what's the best way to word this for this client given their scenario? And so you can get the attorney involved. You can always ask the attorney questions, and a reminder, this is a contract. So if your buyer says, I want my attorney to review the offer, your response to that is absolutely. Let me pull this all together. We'll send it over to the attorney to review prior to submitting. Okay. A lot of times people don't have the attorney review, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't allow them. You have to allow them to do that if they request it. If they have any concerns, then recommend that.
Have you seen people lose when they're making when they're making an offer to purchase? Not be their offer not be accepted because of the contingency they have to sell.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's all part of the terms of the deal, right? So when you're evaluating deals, if you have multiple offers on the table, I'm always evaluating the deals that I have based on price and terms. You know, a lot of times sellers will accept an offer that's lower because it's a cash deal with less contingencies, but they know it's going to get to the closing table. And especially in this market where people are a little more concerned about the financing component or changes to things, people are definitely taking, I mean, they always take it into account, but it's even more critical now.
Paul, with regard to telling the buyer that, yeah, they could have their attorney look at it. I mean, that's obviously prudent advice and something we should always say, but the practical reality is some attorneys take forever to do things, and these offers aren't going to last forever, and you have to submit it by, I think, fairly promptly, right? So.
Yeah, time is of the essence with these.
I think that Scott would be able to turn it around, and
the majority of them would turn that around, especially if you say to them, this is competitive, I need to get this in right away, but the client would like you to take a quick look through. They're familiar enough with the forms that it doesn't take any kind of lengthy review. And a lot of times you're bringing them in because there's something specific, like they have a home sale or something a little outside of the norm where you just want to make sure the language is correct. And so a lot of times they'll just shoot that right over to you in an email.
Yeah, no, I get it, except that we're not talking about the attorney I use. I actually had him look at something a couple of years ago, and it took a couple of days before I got it back.
Well, again, if you go back to real estate attorneys, they should be used to the timing. And if they're not available, then you'd reach out to somebody else like Scott or somebody and have them, give you some help with it so you're not stuck. You don't want to lose the opportunity over that for sure, but you also don't want to ever say to somebody, don't go to an attorney, right? That's
absolutely not. I would never say that. I also wouldn't want to steer them away from their own attorney towards Scott, except I would mention that, well, Scott, look at this pretty fast and get you an answer right away.
Yeah.
Do what you want.
I missed this. Who is Scott?
Scott Sellers is the attorney from Horning and Simone out of the Newton Chestnut Hill office. Okay. Oh, what did I do? There we go. Okay. It was just in the chat, and I saw it, and I apologize. I didn't look who had. Would we potentially want to put in an appraisal contingencies here? Okay. So that's an excellent question. There is an option to put into, I think I'm at the end of this field, maybe not, subject to property appraising at sale price. So there's a couple of schools of thoughts on this. And again, if it's competitive, you need to be careful with this. There are a lot of times when people know the property has a high probability it won't appraise out because the traffic and the amount of interest is pushing it up over potentially where that could be. So there are cases where this could hurt your offer, okay? This would be above and beyond the mortgage contingency piece. So, somebody who's gonna ask a question? No?
Oh, sorry, I'm off mute again. Let me go back.
So the property being subject to appraising at sales price, basically saying you're making that a full contingency, that if you put in $450 and this property appraises for $449, your buyer has an opportunity to walk away and not buy this property. Okay? And so the seller's going to look at it potentially that way. So keep that in mind. And I'll go back to this again when I talk about the mortgage contingency.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, so I can wait. I was going to ask how isn't the mortgage contingency essentially the same, not the same thing, but.
Well, so there's scenarios, yes, essentially the same, but so let's talk about that when we get over here. So
Yeah.
let's go to the contingency addendum. So here's the contingency addendum. Again, I can have it filled out with the sellers and buyers. And again, we pulled this document into the offer, so this is becoming part of the offer. And it has the contingency addendums, the mortgage, inspection, a radon contingency, a pest, and a potential lead paint. So let's start with the mortgage contingency. My folks offered $450,000, right? I should have wrote my dates down because now I don't remember my dates already. Let's go back to the offer. We don't need to save that. Let's go back to the offer for a minute. I need to write my dates down. So we put in here P&S of 513. Closing of 612. Okay? All right, so let me go back. Offer to purchase contingency addendum. So I have a mortgage contingency. What did I tell you my folks are, how much are my folks financing on this? So it's a $450,000 purchase, right? Now what I need to know is not what the people, that we put 5% down with the offer in the P&S, but that's not necessarily what they need to mortgage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to know, are they putting 20% down? Are they putting 5% down? Are they putting 3.5% down? What do they need to do to get a mortgage? So I'm going to say that my buyers are 20% down buyers. So I'm going to actually put 80% here. Now I can do the calculation. I'm going to tell you why I put the 80% here, because we're potentially going to negotiate this offer. The price may change. And if I forget to update this mortgage contingency, I might run into trouble down the line. By putting 80%, it'll be 80% based on the accepted offer. It's kind of another way to sort of protect myself of how I have to change the offer after the fact, okay? Now there's 2 dates in here. It's probably the most confusing contingency out there because of these 2 dates. I almost never see people fill this in correctly. The second one first is the date that the buyer would submit that completed mortgage application. So when would they put that official mortgage application in? When did I tell you we would do that? Anyone remember?
The mortgage.
When were they going to put the official mortgage calculation application in?
Day 16.
Well, yeah, basically a purchase and sale, right?
Yes.
Right? So I can put my purchase and sale date in here or the day after, either one is fine, meaning they'll put their official application in as soon as we execute the purchase and sale. You also will sometimes see in here the words P and S execution.
Yeah,
In
that
other
makes more
words, that,
sense.
if that date moves, then that'll cover that. And then when are they getting their commitment? What did we say when their commitment would look like? Well,
Day 28 through 35.
okay, so yes, they're gonna, so here's what I want you to think about the mortgage commitment. We need a good another 3 weeks from whenever we're signing that P&S, 2 to 3 weeks from when we're signing that P&S to get the appraisal and stuff done and get the commitment.
Great.
But what we're gonna be careful of is that we not commit to a commitment too far ahead of the closing date. Okay?
Too far ahead.
We don't want to go too far ahead of the closing date. So here's this deal in particular. If I were to look at like 30 days out from this, I'd be getting my commitment somewhere around the end of May, right? My closing is June 12th. I might actually want to put this, just give myself a little extra time in today's market and say, I'll get the commitment by June 9th.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, now here's one thing to consider, and then I'll talk about the COVID situation. It takes 3 days, what they call right of rescind. I'm losing the term. It's the rescinding of the deal. So basically, the mortgage broker is going to have your buyer sign something 3 days before the closing, saying that they agreed all the terms and the numbers, because they've got 3 days to walk away from that. And so that by the time the deal closes and they sign the deal, that time frame is over. Okay? Now, under current COVID conditions, so under the quarantine conditions, what you are seeing in here sometimes is that they're actually putting this right up to the closing date. And this is not something you would normally see in a typical market. And the reason they're doing that is because the mortgage companies are doing what they call a VOE, which is a verification of employment, right up to the final minute for these things. And you've got people being furloughed and laid out at unprecedented numbers right now. And so you want to protect your client in case something like that happens and they in fact can't get a mortgage because they lose their job. Okay? So this is very rare that you would see the closing date, but under COVID conditions, you would do that. This will never be shorter than like 30 days out because you need that time to do the appraisal and do all the paperwork. If it's anything short of that 30 days out, you need to talk to the mortgage broker before you put the offer in and say, hey, look, could we get a commitment on this loan by this date and close by this date? Because I know these are fast, you know, how far along with you with the buyers in terms of getting their file done? Okay?
And Paula, I'm just curious, when these sort of instances come up, is my buyer client giving me permission to talk to their mortgage lender or to their attorney? Like, how does that work?
They don't actually have to give you permission. You can call them. The mortgage broker will probably just check with the client to make sure that you're the agent that's working with them and stuff. But yeah, that's fine. And the attorney, it's very common that the communication goes, you know, you're the one that's going to give a lot of the information to the attorney that they need to make sure that it's included in the next contract that's being generated.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay? So then the inspection contingency, if we're going to do an inspection, what did we say the timeline was for that?
7 to 10 days.
7 to 10 days. So we're going to go out. We put in the P&S of 5/13, so which is like the 2 weeks out. And so maybe, you know, we need a couple days for the attorney to get the review done. So maybe we say, look, we'll get the inspection done by May 7th. We're going to move kind of quickly on this. Okay. It could be a couple days after that if you want. That's fine. There is a paragraph in here which everybody should read. This is a difference between the MAR form and the Greater Boston form. The MAR form just says that the inspection will be done within 10 days or 14 days, and you actually put that 10 days. You put the number of days from the executed contract. There's none of this other stuff in there on the MAR form. It's a straight, flat paragraph. In this form, it has something where it says, if in the opinion of the instructor, the property contains serious structural, mechanical, or other defects, and if the repair of such defects would cost the buyer an aggregate more of, then the buyer shall have the option of revoking the agreement. So this is a threshold that you're setting with the seller where you're saying, we're not looking to nickel and dime you. We're not looking for the small stuff. We're looking for the big stuff. Now, you know this house needs a new roof. You're going to go a little higher on this number because you already know the house needs a roof. Okay? But again, so this number is a little strategic in terms of what you put here. But you want to make sure it's reasonable. If it's competitive, they're going to want to see a higher number in here because they're going to want to see that you're not going to try to get out of the deal for just little stuff.
Can you put to be determined in there?
No, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
Because it's part of the contingency from the offer standpoint. So this should be a number. So maybe it's $1,000 because it's not competitive and we just are going to set a limit fairly low. So if we want to get out, we can get out. Maybe it's $5,000 because that looks a little more reasonable and like we're not trying to look for the small stuff. I'm trying to show the buyers, the sellers that we're serious, we're moving forward. We're really only concerned about the big stuff that we can't see. So maybe I'm putting 10,000 in there. Okay?
Paula, should that also be, I mean, I actually know of a situation where someone got out of, a buyer got out of an offer because an inspector went out there and it ended up being like $50,000 worth of fixing. My question to you is, obviously that's a lot, and it was an elderly couple too, but some people, if the home is cheap enough, for lack of better words, and the buyer has a lot of money and doesn't care that's going to cost $50,000 to fix it, would it be the buyer trying to steer you in what price you should put there?
So again, this doesn't have to do with how much, it has to do with what's the threshold of them moving forward with the deal, right? So it has to do with competitive positioning, and it has to do with a threshold of the buyer saying, look, yes, it's okay if there's like $3,000 worth of damage or things that we have to address, we're okay with that. But anything more than that, we're going to be concerned with because we're not going to have the money to do that.
Okay.
Okay. Now that doesn't mean I'm not going back and negotiating potentially out of this to keep the deal together. But the threshold is being set of where the buyer could potentially walk away.
Okay.
All right. Mm-hmm. You would not typically see something like 50,000 in here.
Okay.
Because then you might as well waive the inspection contingency at that point.
Gotcha. Okay. Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
high. Like that's so crazy high. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second date here is when they will notify the seller if they're revoking on the agreement. And so that's typically the day after that inspection contingency. So, you know, if you've got till the 7th to get everything done, then by the 8th, you will notify them if you're not moving forward, because at that point, you'll have all your test results. All right? Make sense? If you're going to do a radon and the offer is going to be contingent on it, again, these are contingencies, then you would check the radon box and you would line up your dates with your inspection contingency. So it would be 5/7 and it would be 5/8.
Do you normally do a radon contingency when you're doing for buyers?
Again, this is all part of the strategic processing. So where we live in New England, radon can be fairly high.
Right.
If your buyer is concerned about it and wants, I can't get this box to show so I can select the date. So weird. I don't know why it's hanging down here. You know, if your buyer doesn't care, because they're like, if there's radon, we'll put a system in, then we don't need a radon contingency. If they potentially want the seller to pay for that or be able to negotiate that, doesn't mean the seller has to do it. It just means if they want to be able to get out of the deal because of that, they could potentially get out of the deal because of that.
Yeah, most houses in New England have radon in them.
Well, you can't say most, a lot do.
Yeah.
A lot do. And again, you know, the acceptable level in Massachusetts is 4.0, and then everything above is considered, needs to be mitigated. But, you know, again, it depends on where that comes in. Okay, I'm gonna type it in because my box isn't cooperating.
So Paula, let's say the radon level comes back at 5. Is that when the negotiating starts, where you say, okay, either you take money off for me to be able to take care of it? Or
Yeah, and then they still could come back and say, we're not going to do it. And your buyers might say, well, that's okay, we're going to go forward because we know it was competitive. But yeah, if it's over the 4.0, you go, we want the property mitigated, or we want a credit for it. You can get, there are companies out there, you can get a quote usually by square footage and stuff. So, you know, they're not, radon systems for the air aren't that expensive. They, you know, they tend to run about $1,500. When there's radon in a water test, and again, we haven't addressed that because there's not a lot of wells around here, but we'll talk about that real quick for anything you do have a well. Radon in a well can take, you know, can cost $5,000 to $10,000 to mitigate. So you have to be careful what you're talking about.
You know, you mentioned on it talks about the EPA levels there, but you mentioned about the state level. So why doesn't it just put the number, you know, the count that's acceptable?
Because there's not a federal number.
It says EPA.
Well, there's not a federal number. Massachusetts is 4.0. New Hampshire is like 12 or 14 or something. It's done by the state.
But this is a Boston form. Okay, all right.
I understand.
All right.
I have another question about these contingencies and the dates.
Yes.
Typically, and again, I go back to Kentucky because it's just all I'm used to. Typically in our contracts, it would say if an issue comes back with one of these contingencies, then the buyer, you know, and the seller have X number of days to resolve them. Is there something in the purchase contract as opposed to this that addresses that?
It would be the purchase and sale date in this. That's the version here, because the attorneys are handling a purchase and sale.
Okay, all right. So it's addressed somewhere then.
It's addressed before the purchase and sale is the assumption here. Yeah.
Okay.
By the time you get to the purchase and sale, all the terms have been identified.
In terms of any extra contingency periods needed to resolve these?
Well, so typically the only contingency in a purchase and sale is for the mortgage, because that goes beyond that date. And then if there was something that was left undone, they could potentially put it in the purchase and sale. A lot of times they'll extend the purchase and sale signing, but it could be handled either way.
Interesting. It seems like it could leave it open to a lot of odd interpretation. You know, as far as, and it more comes down to inspection contingencies.
Inspection
things come back and typically you'd say, you know, once you get this report back, you know.
Stop you right there, because inspection contingencies in Massachusetts are 99.9% of the time considered completed by the time you get to the purchase and sale.
Okay.
And satisfied.
Understand it, but okay, I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm not with you, but I'll go with you.
So like there's an occasion where I've signed a purchase and sale and the radon results haven't been in, but everybody wants to sign the purchase and sale. And so the attorney will add language that if the radon level comes back over 4, then the seller agrees to mitigate and install a radon mitigation system.
Okay, so
Right,
it's
so there might be
okay,
something
great.
like that
That's
handling
interesting. Okay.
But again, most of our, the way the 2 contracts are set up is so that we get through that inspection contingency period. The pest inspection contingency, if they want a separate contingency for the pest, again, they can do a pest inspection, but do they want a separate contingency for it? They would pick this, and again, you would line your dates up with your offer dates. So this would be the 5/7, your inspection dates. This would be 5/7, and this would be 5/8. Okay?
Yeah.
The last one is lead paint. I'm going to give you the lowdown on lead paint. So all this says is that the buyer may, at the buyer's own expense, within 10 days of the acceptance of the agreement, have the levels of the house professionally inspected. Okay. I just want to be very clear about lead paint. Any house built prior to 1978 needs to have a lead paint form. I can't remember the term now. Lead paint form signed, which has the lead paint notification pages, and then there's a separate lead paint form. I can show you quickly what that looks like. The seller always signs and fills out the lead paint form first. All the lead paint form says is, does the seller know of the existence of lead paint, or do they not know of or is it unknown? And if they know of lead paint, is there a report? Are they providing reports for lead paint, or do they not have reports? That's what the seller attests to, okay? The seller is not obligated to de-lead a house to sell the house in Massachusetts. The seller is obligated under law that if a lead paint test has ever been done and there are lead paint reports available, they must provide them to the buyer. So they must identify that the testing's been done and they must provide the reports. If it's never been done, they mark it unknown, and that's an acceptable response, and you move forward. Okay? Now, is that clear?
Yes.
On the buy side, the buyer is going to sign. We got the notification, and we got the seller's choices of they know or they don't know about lead. They provided the reports. They didn't provide they don't have any reports to provide. This buyer's going to sign off on that. We got the notification. We got the reports they provided if they had them, or we got no reports. And there's also a part on that form where they say they have waived the 10-day right to inspect, or they're going to do a lead paint inspection. Yeah, Andy?
Yeah, question. Does the Title V stuff come in under the inspection thing?
Okay, let me go back to that in a minute. Let me get through lead paint.
Okay.
So I will answer that though, okay? Because that's actually not typically part of this contract, and I'll address why that's not in here.
Okay.
So last thing on the lead paint. I see a lot of new agents will check this off and say, we're gonna do a lead paint inspection, or they'll tell their folks, well, you definitely wanna do a lead paint inspection. Be careful advising your clients that way, okay? Now, if they have young children, they may absolutely wanna do a lead paint inspection, but a very high percentage of sellers are going to want them to do that lead paint inspection post-closing. Why? Because if your buyer does a lead paint inspection, let's say it comes back with lead paint, they get out of the deal because of it, what does your seller now have to do? They now have to disclose the existence of lead paint and provide that report to people by law. And that could potentially affect the value of the property. So a lot of sellers, if you say we're going to lead paint test, will come back and say, we are not going to allow that as part of this process. Or we're not going to allow that as part of the contingencies. Because the reality is, and somebody once said to me, well, why can't we test? If we find lead paint, they have to do lead. They do not have to do lead. That's not the law. They can still transfer that house to you. So if they don't want it to be uncovered prior to that, then they would just say, you can test it, but you can test it after closing and then handle it from there. Okay? And there is a state website where you can look up properties, the lead paint report. If you Google Massachusetts lead paint reports, it'll take you in a database, and you can put in the property address and see if there's a lead paint report on file for it. Now, I want to address two other things. I'll go back to Andy's Title V. Look, are we good with the lead paint before I move on? Are there any questions on that?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, let me address two things. One is a well, which we see very little of in this market out here, but you do see them in Massachusetts. So you may want to include in a home inspection a well test, because the well filtration and radon filtration stuff can be very expensive. So you could put that just in that section 8 of the regular offer. Go back there and just put in, subject to a well inspection or water test. The Title V. Title V in Massachusetts is responsibility of the seller to provide a Title V in the case of a private septic, a passing Title V, in order to close the property. So there's not typically a need for the buyer to address that in here because it's on the seller's responsibility side anyway.
I
Okay.
saw a listing, I saw a listing today, actually, Taunton, I think, where the buyer needs to do their own Title V inspection.
Okay, so you will see deals like that because either the people don't have any money, sometimes if it's a tear down or a bank-owned property, what you have to know is you can transfer a deed without a Title V in certain circumstances, and then there's so many days before that can be rectified with the city and state to get that clarified. So you definitely have to have an attorney involved, and you definitely have to know what the situation is for something like that. Anything that has financing involved, that's going to be tricky to do. So that also has to typically be a cash buyer if that's going to go through that way. Financing is going to want that Title V before they're going to move forward with the financing.
The reason I bring it up is
money expert out of the deal for it.
the reason I bring up the Title V question is I went through one of those continuing education things out in Natick for a couple of hours, and it's Title V is pretty easy to pass. Actually, it's a long form, but according to this guy who helped write the law 25 years ago, who owns one of these companies that does all the septic stuff. And so he said it's probably a good idea for a buyer to have the inspector check out the septic system, even if it did pass Title V, because the Title V inspection does not require them to inspect the tank itself, and the tank could be leaking. I mean, it gets very technical, but it could be an expensive proposition. That's the only reason I bring it up.
Okay, so I'm going to talk standards here, Andy, okay?
Yeah.
Typically, the title, in order to do a Title V, the company has to pump the tank and then inspect the lines and stuff. So again, I'm going to take what you're talking about is one guy's opinion on that. You very rarely will see a buyer call in someone to do a Title V or tank inspection unless there's some concern. And the other piece of that is you can never assume something's going to pass Title V. We've had out in Westford where everything is septic. We've had brand new neighborhoods that were 5 years old and people are like, oh, it'll be fine, it'll pass. And they all failed. The entire neighborhood failed. And then you've got systems. My house was 60 years old and the septic was that awesome. You can't assume just because of age it's not going to pass, because if it's built on good soil and they were built well, they'll last forever. So, again, a good title company, a good title inspector is going to look at the whole thing, figure out what does and doesn't need to be done. They watch flow rates, they do other testing, so that typically, you start talking about leaking, they typically can uncover that with the testing they do. I don't know why you would bring in your own to do sort of the same kind of test, but again, we'll take that on a grain of salt. That's not something you typically see, so.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Good with the offer? Let me do a quick switch over here. I'm just going to show you these other two addendums. Real
And
quick.
You're still going to send this offer to us, correct, to look at it?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Let me order it too, so that when I don't know if you know how you can do this in Dotloop, you can move the forms around and order them. So when you create your package, they're in a nice order and they're not all over the place.
Gotcha.
Isn't that nice?
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
I know, I love that, because then when you pick them and you make a package out of them, they're in the right order, they're not all screwed up. The addendum for integrated disclosure, which we call the TRID addendum in Massachusetts, is how you'll hear people refer to it. It's all just a signature. There's nothing in here you have to fill out. The buyer signs it, the seller signs it. Take the time to read it. It basically says that under the new TRID laws that came into play back in 2015, if there's stuff that needs extra time because of those TRID laws, everybody agrees to play fair in the sandbox is basically what that says. And so that became part of our contracts back in 2015. And the other one is the newest addendum, which is the Coveted Addendum, which basically also says that's a MAR form version, and again, I think for most of these, you're just going to check these off that, basically we all understand we're in unprecedented times and all parties agree to work together. If there is a delay of some sort because of the COVID interference, maybe the government shuts down closings, maybe we can't get an inspector in, whatever that is. that it would be handled. Okay, you can use this form, or you can reach out to the attorney. I know Scott Sellers has his own version. I think it's a little clear, pardon me, I think it's a little more direct and a little less ambiguous than this is, but that's up to the buyers. You want to have something attached to protect your buyers for the COVID. Even for the offers that are going through without them, they're putting it in the purchase and sale. Okay, and I will for intensive purposes. So let me show you, I would have the buyer's mandatory agency disclosure form. I'd have their pre-approval in here. I could scan in a copy of the check, and then I can click on all the documents here. I can then share that to the agent as one document. I can also download that, and that will make one PDF. So right now I got a PDF file that's saved. It's showing me this here, so I can save it. It's got the offer. It's got the offer to purchase contingency addendum. It's got my integrated disclosure all in one nice document to send over to the listing agent. And please do it that way. Please don't send over each form individually. That is a listing agent's nightmare, trying to manage that. You want to make it easy for them to go through, make sure they can keep all the pages together, make sure they can have the seller sign it all nice and compact and easy. For educational purposes, I will just do a quick jaunt here over to purchase and sale that's in this file somewhere.
May I just ask if there's an agency disclosure form?
Yeah, agency disclosure form should have been signed prior to you showing them property, so that would have been in the file, and you would.
Okay, you don't submit it with the purchase contract. You just keep it separate.
You do. We would talk about. You
Okay.
put the agency disclosure form, pre-approval letter, copy of your offer check, with account number covered for security purposes, and then all these your offer docs and addendums.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. So let me show you a typical purchase and sale. Again, this is drawn up by Honig and Simone. Scott Sellers actually did this. This is why you get a real estate attorney. As an agent and as a brokerage, we don't do drafts or anything of the purchase and sale. We let the attorneys use their own version because so much of this stuff goes so deep. They get into the description, the deeds. It talks about what the price was that everybody's agreed to, all kinds of possession and all kinds of extra language in here, as you can see. Efforts about closing and title clearing, use of money, insurance, adjustments of taxes, all that stuff's handled. So when you're an agent and you're reviewing the P&S before your client signs it, because the attorney's going to review it, you want to make sure real quickly that nothing's been missed in terms of anything else that might have been negotiated between the offer and the P&S. Like, you need to let the attorney know, hey, Scott, we've done the home inspection. The buyers have agreed to do the furnace cleaning and to get the pest guy out to do mice treatment, so that he can include that in the purchase and sale. Okay, and you want to make sure that gets included. But as an agent, I just quickly look at it, make sure the parties look correct. I did have an attorney once send over the wrong P&S, which, believe it or not, if we had signed it. So make sure the parties look correct, the address looks correct, the pricing looks right, that I do slip down to the broker fee, especially if I'm on the listing side, make sure that's correct. In this case, Scott's good because he always puts as agreed, so he doesn't worry about that. And then it just says it will disperse to Keller Williams based on our agreement. So he's not getting into the terms, because in this particular case, this is a 5% commission, but listing agent keeping 3%, we're offering a 2% co-broke. And then it gets into, then you might flip to it has the mortgage contingency dates. You might want to check your dates and amounts there to make sure everything's clean. And then you'd go down usually to the bottom where there might be some additional addendums in terms. Like in this case, there's a big addendum A that one of the attorneys attached, and then there's a repair addendum, and then there's, I'll show you, I mean, these, this is why you have a real estate agent. There's a wire fraud notice, make sure nobody's sending money to the wrong place. There's another rider, so that's a different, probably the other attorney put their own rider in. This is why you have an attorney, because there's all kinds of things that they have to take into account. And then in this case, there's a repair agreement on what the parties have agreed to that was done separately as opposed to just putting it at the end of the P&S. Okay.
Is there an estimated cost, just a kind of a range for an attorney fee for this?
Best to talk to Scott about that. He's really good at talking to the clients about it because it depends on what they do. They can just help them with the draft and the review of the purchase and sale, but not really represent them in the closing. or they can do a package where they actually do the closing and do the power of attorney and everything. So they usually will have pricing set up differently. Sometimes too, if they're representing the bank for the buyer, they'll do the P&S review for free, but keep in mind, when they do that, they're really representing the bank. You know, so, I mean, again, you want to have them talk to them about pricing. Probably between $1,000 and $1,500, depending on how inclusive you get.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay. Questions on any of that? I know that's a lot of info, right? Let me skip back over to here, make sure I've got everything on our presentation, but I'm pretty sure I do. Oh, one thing I did not talk about. Let's talk about this real quickly before we wrap up for the last few minutes. How do you get paid? How do you
Collect
get
bottles?
paid? Huh?
Collect bottles?
What are you saying, Tim?
Collect bottles?
Collect bottles. How do you get paid in the deal?
Doesn't the listing broker's agency cut a check to your agency and then they cut a check to you?
That's what we're hoping for, right? So that's what we're hoping for. Let's let me go back to screen share real quick, because I just want to make sure this is where you're only going to make this mistake once in your entire career, and hopefully, like me, I watched somebody else make it, so I actually never made it. So let me go into MLS here real quick. You always, as a buyer's agent, want to make sure that you watch when you're setting up. This is part of why you want to go into the full listing. And again, we teach more of this in the buyer class, but I just want to make sure you're protected from this standpoint, especially since we're talking about offers. So you're always, when you're looking at the full version, can you guys see my screen again?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Am I in the full version? Yep. You're always going to want to make sure you come down to this bottom and look at the compensation. So this buyer agency compensation is 2%. They don't offer anything to a facilitator. So again, this is making sure your agency disclosure is set up properly, because if you were a facilitator on that agency disclosure form and you put an offer in, they're actually not going to compensate you. The Berkshire Hathaway Commonwealth policy is we offer the same to the buyer agent and facilitator regardless of, so if you're getting 2.5%, you offer 2.5% to the facilitator for the you put in. But that's not what you see out there for all the offers. Who's moving around? I gotta mute somebody. I gotta mute Ashley. Okay. So make sure you're looking at this and checking this to make sure that you're gonna get paid, okay? If you're pulling in the MLS, you're referencing the MLS in your offer, this is how you showed it, you're an MLS agent, then you can assure you're gonna get paid and we can fight for that commission. What if the offer was withdrawn and you showed it? Well, it wasn't active. It technically would be covered, but always better to put it in a case when it's not clear. Buyer's agent to be paid 2.5% of sale price at closing by seller or by listing brokerage, okay? Can be added right into the offer if it's not clear. And so if anything outside of MLS, maybe it's a non-MLS listing. You need to write the compensation in because there's no offer of compensation. There's no way for you to get paid unless you write that in. So be very careful of that. We had a $3 million deal in our office where the agent put the offer in on an off-market property and never wrote the compensation in. And the team leader called later and said, you are paying us, right? I said, well, that might be up for conversation because it was never written in the offer. Go talk to your client about being compensated, right? So we're typically getting paid this way. We can also write it in the offer if there isn't terms defined, and or we could be potentially getting paid by our buyer because we have a buyer rep agreement to protect us in the case that we're not getting money from somewhere else. But I would be very clear to your buyers if the expectation when you're writing the offer is that they're going to pay the fee, I would be very clear about that up front so that they don't get any surprises. And I would even potentially write that right into the offer. Buyer agent brokerage fee being paid by buyer at closing of 2.5%. Andy?
Yeah, the question I have is kind of what prompted it was your mention of going quickly through that PNS that Scott did with Keller, and they kept 3 and they paid the buyer agent.
No,
2.
actually, I kept 3 and paid them 2.
Okay, how do we know? Because I often see 2% on the stuff around here.
You have no, it's not your business to know.
Oh, you can't know that. Okay.
It's not your business. My contract with my client is my business, not yours.
Okay.
Now, let's say, to address where you're heading with this, let's say you have a buyer broker agreement with your client for 2.5%, okay? And they're offering 2%. And it's not competitive, and you've done a lot of work with this client, and so you want 2.5%. You can say to the buyer, look, I'll write up this offer, but just so you know, I'm getting 2% from the listing company, but there'll be an additional 0.5% that you'll pay at closing. It can go that way. It can go that when you're showing the property, you tell the agent, I'm rejecting your offer of compensation in MLS. And then when you show the property and you write an offer, you write into the offer, you know, buyer's agent to receive 2.5% of sale price at closing. You know, because the buyer has an obligation to that, and the buyer wants the seller to take care of that as part of a transaction. Okay? We don't see a lot of that in today's market because it's so competitive. Because we don't want to put our buyer in an unfair position because they need to have extra money taken out of the transaction. But in what we would call more of a normal market, you do see more of that.
I mean, I guess from my perspective as a seller's agent, your seller's agents do a lot of work and lay out money too for listing the property and photography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so, yeah, the 3 and 2 makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, so here's Berkshire Hathaway Commonwealth's policy, just to be very clear. You must offer the co-broke in line with what's in that marketplace. So if the majority of listings, which is what around here is 2.5%, Newton, any of the areas around here are 2.5%. Your co-broke, you must be offering 2.5%. If you look at the Westford market, almost all of them are offering 2%. And so that's why I can do that there. Now around here, that doesn't stop me from charging 5.5 and keeping 3 and offering 2.5%. But as a company, we are not a discount brokerage. So our policy is, and we don't want you to hurt your seller's position in the market. So our policy is that your co-broke offering needs to be in line with what the market is in that town or city.
Yeah, okay. I know we're not supposed to talk about these things, but I just have noticed.
We can in the contained area here like this, but yeah.
I mean, but I noticed around here, mostly it's 2% to the buyer's agent.
When you say around here, where are you talking about specifically?
In my city.
I would challenge that. I bet if I ran a report in the Quincy area, you would see it's also closer to 2.5% for the majority.
Well, okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
And again, anyone who looks for that exception for me as a manager, I'll just go run a quick report out of MLS to see what that looks like, just to confirm.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yep. So we good? It's a lot of information. It's a lot of time on the computer. I will save that offer and put that in the folder with the recording.